Steve wakes up Tuesday morning with $1 trillion in his bank account. Steve does not know what that means yet. Nobody actually does. Let's find out together. Here's the problem. Your brain cannot picture $1 trillion. Nobody's can, so let's make it physical. If you stacked 1 trillion $1 bills, the stack would reach 67,866 miles into space. That's a quarter of the way to the moon. In cash. Steve just woke up with a quarter of a moon stack. Let's try another way to picture it. If Steve spent $1 million every single day, not saved, spent, gone, it would take him 2,740 years to run out of money. Steve would need to spend $1 million a day, since before the Roman Empire existed to be broke by now. So today we're going to actually spend it. All of it. We're mapping out exactly what $1 trillion can buy, fix, build, and break. Because trust me, Steve is going to break some things. First instinct every time, buy something flashy. Steve could buy all 30 NBA teams' combined value, roughly $190 billion, and still have $810 billion left over. Steve does this on impulse before breakfast. Steve has never watched a full basketball game. Here's the part that breaks people's brains. Buying all 30 NBA teams only used 0.08% of Steve's money. 0.08%. He could do that 1,250 more times. Steve is not even close to feeling a dent. He checks his balance just to be sure. Next, cars. Steve buys one of every car currently in production on Earth. Every single model, every trim. Bugatti, Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, even the weird three-wheeled ones nobody asked for. Total cost, about $50 billion. He has nowhere to park any of them. After an hour of buying things, Steve realizes something uncomfortable. Stuff doesn't actually move the needle. He spent $240 billion in 60 minutes, and his balance, rounded to the nearest dollar, looks exactly the same. Steve sits down. He needs a different plan. So Steve thinks bigger. $1 trillion is roughly the entire annual GDP of the Netherlands. Steve could, in theory, fund an entire nation's economic output for a year. Steve looks up the Netherlands. He's never been to the Netherlands. Steve is now strangely invested in the Netherlands. What about buying an entire company outright? Apple is worth around $3.5 trillion. Steve can't buy all of Apple, but he could buy roughly 28% of it enough to be the single largest shareholder on Earth, with more influence over Apple's decisions than anyone alive. Steve doesn't even like his current phone. Steve could also fund an entire space program from scratch. NASA's annual budget is about $25 billion. Steve could fund NASA in full, every year, for 40 years straight, and still have money left to start his own. He briefly considers naming a rocket after himself. We're not going to stop him, but somewhere between buying basketball teams and naming a rocket after himself, Steve starts to feel something unexpected. Guilt. Because while Steve is debating rocket names, roughly 700 million people on Earth live on less than $2.15 a day. Steve sits down. The fun stuff suddenly feels smaller. Here's a number that matters. Economists estimate it would take roughly $100 to $175 billion a year to end extreme poverty worldwide. With $1 trillion, Steve could fund that effort in full for nearly a decade. Just from interest on the money he hasn't even spent yet, global cancer research funding is roughly $30 billion a year. Steve could fund the entire world's cancer research for over 30 years straight. He hasn't cured anything personally. But somewhere, a researcher who used to apply for grants for 6 months a year now just does research, closer to home. If Steve gave $1 trillion directly to every American, split evenly across all 335 million people, that's about $3,000 each. Not life-changing for everyone, but real. Rent, a car repair, a breath of room. Steve starts to understand that big numbers are really just a lot of small numbers. But here's the catch nobody mentions. Just giving away $1 trillion all at once would crash currencies, spike inflation, and actually hurt the very people Steve is trying to help. Sudden, massive cash injections break economies. Steve learns that helping people well is harder than having money. So Steve does what serious billionaires actually do. He starts a foundation. Money invested slowly, intentionally, releasing a few $1 billion a year toward clean water, education, and disease research. Not flashy. Not a rocket with his name on it. Just steady, boring, world-changing work. Here's the part that genuinely impresses Steve. If he only spends the interest his $1 trillion earns roughly 5% a year, or $50 billion, and never touches the original amount, he can fund massive projects forever. The trillion never runs out, it just keeps producing. Steve sets aside $200 billion specifically for full-ride college scholarships. At an average cost of $35,000 a year, that funds roughly 1.4 million students through 4 full years of college. Steve never finished his own degree. This one means something different to him. He sets aside another $50 billion as zero-interest loans for small businesses, the kind that get rejected by banks for being too risky. Steve was once told his own business idea was too risky to fund. Steve remembers that feeling. Steve doesn't want anyone else to feel small for trying. Here's a problem nobody warns you about. Within a week, Steve receives 4 million emails. Distant cousins he's never met. People claiming to be old classmates. A guy who insists he invented the wheel and deserves royalties. Steve cannot read all of them. Steve barely sleeps. Then there's the harder part. Steve can no longer tell who actually likes him. New friends appear overnight. People laugh harder at his jokes than they used to. Steve starts wondering if anyone in the room would still be there if the $1 trillion disappeared tomorrow. Steve also discovers something practical and slightly terrifying. Extreme wealth requires extreme security. Bodyguards, background checks on new friends, a house that now resembles a small fortress. Steve, who used to leave his front door unlocked, now has 3 layers of gates. And yes, taxes are still real. Even at this scale, Steve owes a significant portion in taxes, depending on how the money is structured. There's no version of this where Steve simply keeps $1 trillion completely untouched. The number on paper and the number in reality are never quite the same. Steve starts being more careful about who he spends time with, not paranoid, just intentional. He calls an old friend from before all this, someone who knew him when his biggest financial worry was $47 in a checking account. They laugh about it now. Some things money can't replace. Eventually, Steve starts thinking less about what he can buy and more about what he wants to be remembered for. Not the rocket, not the basketball teams, the scholarships, the clean water, the small coffee shop that didn't close. That's the version of rich that actually sticks. Here's the strangest twist of the entire story. After enough time, the actual number $1 trillion stops being the point. What mattered was never the size of the number. It was what Steve chose to do with the time, attention, and weight that came with it. Here's the actual lesson, and it applies whether you have $47 or $1 trillion. Money doesn't change who you are. It removes the excuses and amplifies whatever was already there. If Steve was generous before, he became very generous. If Steve was careless before, he would have become very careless. So here's the real question. This video is actually asking, if you woke up tomorrow with $1 trillion, what would the first 24 hours reveal about who you already are? Steve found out the hard way. You get to think about it before it happens. That's actually the better deal. Steve still has his $1 trillion, by the way. He just doesn't lead with it anymore. He leads with the coffee shop. He leads with the phone call. Same Steve. Bigger number. Better story. Don't wait for $1 trillion to find out who you already are.